Well, I think if everybody can turn on their cameras among the panelists, it looks like it's time to get started. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar on the interchangeability designation for biosimilars and ensuring the continuity of patient care. My name is Steve Strani, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today. We have a wealth of perspectives. We have experts today who will be discussing the patient perspective, discussing the physician perspective, the pharmacy's perspective, and the regulator's perspective on this area. I look back on my 30 years of working in DC on these sort of policy issues and remember back when we didn't even have terminology like interchangeability or even biosimilars. And now today there is ongoing debate about a number of issues that seemed rather settled. And we're going to get everybody's insights today. For all of you, I urge you all to use the functions in the webinar platform to send us questions. My role and your role are going to be to come up with some questions that we can ask the panelists, and I'll try to sort through the questions we get and present those to the panelists at the end. I've asked everybody on the panel to make this as conversational and free-flowing as possible and not to hesitate to interject. And I'll do the same throughout to try to make sure that we're drilling down to get everybody's questions answered. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight is later on in the slides, you'll see some links and some QR codes for some background materials that I think many of you will find very helpful, and also some information about opportunities that may exist to comment to policymakers on some of these issues we're going to discuss today. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Michael Riley.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate it, and I want to echo your comments with regards to welcoming people to this webinar. It's an incredibly important topic. We actually, in September, did a podcast on the same topic, and even since then, which was September 6th, things have evolved. It's a kind of a continuously evolving landscape. Just before we begin, I want to just give a little background on myself, and then I'm going to turn it around to each of the panelists for them to introduce themselves. And then, as Steve said, we're going to have a pretty open and free-flowing discussion. I want to, obviously, as the executive director of ASBM, I want to thank and welcome Dr. Ralph McKibben, who is our chairperson, Dr. Schneider, who is our advisory board chair, and Andy Spiegel, who is a founding member of ASBM and actually joins us from Japan today, which I am extremely grateful for. Just by way of background, I have been the executive director of ASBM since it was formed in 2010, which was right after the Affordable Care Act gave the authority to set up a biosimilars pathway in the US. And we, since then, 13 years, have been extremely active with a primary focus of working as educators, mostly with regulators and policymakers. And that's on a global level, not just here in the US. We have done a lot of work, and I think Andy will talk a little bit about that because he's done a lot of it with me. Additionally, my background, I was in the Secretary's office at the Department of Health and Human Services from 2002 to 2008. And I was there during and worked with Secretaries Thompson and Leavitt on the creation and implementation of Part D. So I do bring kind of a regulator's perspective to this, I think, uniquely within this group. and also a policymaker's perspective to kind of look at the various pieces of legislation that we're going to talk about today and are concerned about. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Andy Spiegel, and we'll just go through the panelists and let each of them kind of give an introduction about their backgrounds. Thanks.
Sure. Thank you, Michael. Hi, everybody. My name is Andrew Spiegel, and I have a couple of hats. I am the CEO of the Global Colon Cancer Association, and we are an umbrella organization of all colorectal cancer patient groups around the world. And my other hat that I wear is that I'm the board chair of the World Patients Alliance, which is the largest patient organization on the planet, working across all diseases. And we have about 460 patient group members from 113 countries, and really do represent the patient voice in policy matters around the world. But as Michael said, I've worked with him now for 12 or 13 years on the really important topic of biologic medicines and biosimilar medicines in the United States, and as Michael says, globally. We have literally traveled the world meeting with regulators and policymakers to ensure that patients are at the center of all of these policy discussions on biosimilars as these products now make their way into the healthcare system. So I'm really looking forward to providing a couple of points today when it's my turn. But with that, I'll turn it over.
Okay, I'm next on the lineup. My name is Phil Schneider. I'm a pharmacist by training. I serve as chair of the advisory committee for the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines. I'm also a professor of pharmacy at the College of Pharmacy at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. Previously serving the profession, I've been past president of the American Society of Health System Pharmacy, as well as vice president of the International Pharmaceutical Federation, or FIP. And from an interdisciplinary standpoint, which is an important thing to me, past president of the American Society of Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition, which is an organization representing physicians, pharmacists, dietitians, and nurses. Ralph?
I guess I'm up. I'm Dr. Ralph McKibben, and as Andy was saying, he has different hats, and I very much wear different hats. I'm a clinical gastroenterologist. I've been in practice for almost 40 years in Western Pennsylvania. And I think just as my personality, I'm a big believer in changing the world and making things better. And so I became involved with organized medicine with the idea that I wanted to influence influencers and make change instead of just complaining. So I have been involved in our state society and past president of the Pennsylvania Society of Gastroenterology, involved with the Digestive Disease National Coalition in Washington, D.C., which is an umbrella organization of 40 different groups or so, practitioners, patient advocacy groups, pharmacy groups, and legislative groups who meet together and try to come up with a consensus agenda and legislate on the Hill, meet with the FDA and the legislators and policymakers. I'm on the board of governors of the American College of Gastroenterology and have been involved with their education process, and actually past course director for the World Congress of Gastroenterology. And I am now currently chair of the Alliance for Safe Biologics. So what does that mean? Well, I'm going to run through some slides here. It's going to be conversational, but I view this as a vocabulary lesson. As a stakeholder at the table with different stakeholders, we often have different definitions or what we think is going on. And so I understand about 40 different countries represented today. So the word interchangeable may have different meanings. And the purpose of the slides is just to give you a visual reference so you can see the word that I'm using, what we're talking about, and put us on the same common ground as to what is an interchangeable, how did it come about. So let's see if I can get these slides to advance. So first of all, let's talk about biologic medicines. Most of these are what we call monoclonal antibodies, which are used for chronic inflammatory conditions. And so we have names like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, etc. Many of these are systemic diseases, and you use an infusion or injection. But now there's actually some diseases like in the eye, etc., that are localized. So there's different ways of giving it. So after these medicines were invented, the idea came along, we don't have generics. Can we make something very similar. These are living organism derived products from yeast, et cetera. They're antibodies. And so you can never actually make it identical, but you can make it very, very, very similar. And that is what definition of biosimilar is. So the FDA, in consultation with different groups, has decided that, well, and not just the FDA, but other world organizations, but in our country, the FDA, how do we approve this? Do they have to start from the ground up and do all those studies? Well, they wanted to do an abbreviated pathway, just so they came up with this structural equivalent. We measure the blood levels, et cetera, like that, and then we'll give a designation of biosimilar. You can see that QR code there. There is no one size fits all approach then to the development, because there's a past history of other products that have gone before, other biosimilars, et cetera. And it's sort of a moving system, but it is data based. And the idea then is that the FDA will say, you did studies that shows it works for one disease. Maybe we could extrapolate that and say it works for Crohn's, and we'll also use it for rheumatoid arthritis, et cetera. So it creates a little bit of uncertainty from a practitioner standpoint. And when we talk a little bit more, I want to talk about the depth of complexity of patients in the doctor-patient relationship. So many people see the world as simple. We look at the world from our standpoint, but we don't understand necessarily how complex it may be from somebody else's viewpoint. An interchangeable biosimilar provides an additional level of certainty. If you look at the history of medications, quality, and safety, we have evolved over time. Safety is a process, not a thing. What we do is we constantly invent new ways of looking at things. If anybody's in the medicine world, they may remember that ranitidine was recently pulled from the market because of NDMA cancer-causing concerns after many, many years on the market. So just like auto safety and other safety, things change with time. And as a practitioner, if I'm not going to be involved with switching a medicine or switching to equivalent of a generic concept, I want the extra assurance of knowing that when I send you out in the world, you're getting what we agreed to in our doctor-patient relationship. So interchangeability in this country, in the United States, is a specific designation that requires additional data. There isn't a single pathway for this either, just like the biosimilars. Again, it's a moving target. It depends on what other studies have been there, but it is a data-driven process. When the concept of interchangeability was created, there were a lot of groups there involved, and I think Andy and Mike and Phil are going to talk about how the groups and stakeholders got together to go for this approval. And but just know that as a practitioner, this additional confidence builder is very important. So these are just some slides from studies done by ASBM, where we polled physicians in different areas and around the world. And these slides these studies are available on the website. So what is the confidence level in biosimilars? As practitioners, we believe in biosimilars. 92% say, yeah, they work and they're the same, and we can prescribe them, but it isn't necessarily the same as switching. So we're prescribing to new patients. You can see very high level of confidence. And I think if you look at the other studies, these are not comparison studies done at the same time. So confidence can build with time as we get experience. So it doesn't mean that Canada, for instance, is 10% less confident. Different study done at a different time. Would I switch a patient to a biosimilar? Absolutely. I think 80% of people would do that. But it has to be within the doctor-patient relationship where we agree that this is something that they could do. Why this level of discomfort? And this is what I want to just talk about, the complexity of the doctor-patient relationship. When we do drug studies, for instance, I'll just use Crohn's as an example. We use Crohn's patients that are easily identifiable. I like to talk about the bell curve of disease. Some people are so mild they don't know they have it. Other people are so severe you can't stop it. And these products are used in the moderate to severe group. And so we have a lot of variables here that may or may not be accounted for in studies. Do we have the right racial and ethnic groups comparison? Do we have ages? Do we have sexual differences looked at? What about other medical conditions? Do you have two kidneys, one kidneys? Do your kidneys work? Lung disease, heart disease? All of these variables often are excluded in the studies so that we can't, as a physician and patient, just say switch it. And so the idea is, with this complexity, I want to sit down and talk to you because it takes years often. It may take a year or two to become diagnosed, even in the modern age, and then a year or two to, one, declare the severity and go up the pole and end up on these medicines. It's not something that where I send you out and you come back 6 months from now and I find out you're on a different medicine. And this concept is global. If you look around the world, the physician and patient choosing in the doctor-patient relationship is important or critical over many years here and different areas of the world. So this is a physician-patient concept that I like to feel is universal because that is what a physician and patient do. This isn't something down at the, a widget that you buy and it's totally interchangeable. So this concept then is what we call non-medical switching. You go to the pharmacy or they say, oh, we're switching you because your insurance carrier or whatever can save money or make more profit, and we're just going to switch it. And we certainly don't want switching without information and notification of the patient, who is the driver, the customer, and the physician, who is their advisor. So then, does interchangeable make us more comfortable? The answer is yes. We feel this is more comfortable. And again, this is the US definition of interchangeable. In some areas, they feel that all biosimilars are interchangeable, but that is not the very specific definition that we used here because we want that extra level of assurance going forth to infinity that this concept has been proven to be stable and that is going to be monitored. So that's my last slide, and I just want to throw that out there. And I think I want to highlight the complexity of the doctor-patient relationship, the complexity of healthcare diagnosis and healthcare management, because this isn't just like going down to pick up food at the grocery store. Do you buy the generic or the store brand or whatever? Can you save a couple of dollars? This is a very complex relationship from a physician and patient relationship. Andy will talk about the patient relationship for sure, but as a physician, I'm just spelling this out there and starting the conversation that we view this as a complex situation for which we need to have input, and that is been shown in these studies from around the world by ASBM there. So that's my initial presentation. As we get conversational, there'll be questions, and we can certainly bring that up in the panel discussion. I'll hand off then.
Thanks, Dr. McKibben. I'm going to pick it up right from the last thing he said, and then touch on a few specific things he commented on, because I think it's important to kind of highlight. The last thing he said is that in some places, they consider all biosimilars interchangeable. And to be clear, part of the challenge, what he said in the beginning, was that different words have different meanings to different people. The first thing I think we need to establish, and this for me is as a former regulator and policymaker, that if you're not on the same page with regards to what the definition you're talking about is, then you can't be creating policy around something that one group considers to be one thing and one group considers to be something else. And so I start with the idea that different places, if you take the European approach to interchangeable biosimilar, and in many respects, a lot of the slides that Dr. McKibben presented were on, how physicians feel about basically non-medical switching, about switching by third parties, about confidence level with regards to interchangeable biosimilars. But really what we're going to delve into, I think, as you go through my conversation, is policy that's attempted, that is really undermining and leveraging the confusion over terms that mean different things to different people and different places. And so let's start really with the idea of interchangeable biosimilars. The European definition, and then really last fall, the Europeans put out a statement that essentially said that all biosimilars approved in the EU are interchangeable. It has been clear from the number of years that we've been involved with biosimilars at ASBM, which is 13 years, that Europe obviously has been the leader in terms of the development of biosimilars with regards to market share and uptake, and confidence there is extremely high with regards to biosimilars, as it is here in the US. But when they refer to biosimilars as interchangeable, they're talking about the idea that every biosimilar is something that a physician should feel confident that they could prescribe in place of a reference product. And by that definition, that's true in the US as well. They are interchangeable in the US in the same way they are in Europe. I think it's important for people to understand this, because a lot of the conversation around this is, well, everyone knows that Europe is ahead of the US, and in Europe, all biosimilars are interchangeable, and that's not true in the US. So a lot of the policy we're going to talk about today is to try and get us to, quote, catch up with Europe. But since interchangeable means a different thing in Europe than it does in the US, either through really not knowing that distinction, I think some confusion about what it means here versus there, and that additional idea of an interchangeable biosimilar in the United States means you have been approved with additional data. By the way, it's important to note that not every biosimilar in the US that's been approved as an interchangeable requires additional studies. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we get into specific policies that have been proposed to undermine the FDA's ability to provide additional studies, or require them, I should say, in the case of particular manufacturers. But throughout this presentation, as Steve Strandy said, we have QR codes that you can see. I would recommend folks to go and watch the 1 minute 49-second video where the EU, specifically the EMA, puts out to explain what it means to be an interchangeable biosimilar, because it's very clear from that video that it means something different in the EU than it does here in the US. And it has nothing to do, in particular, as an interchangeable biosimilar does in the United States, with the idea of pharmacy or automatic substitution. It simply is to make a statement about the fact that a biosimilar in the EU that's been approved is safe and effective and can be substituted in place of a reference product, which, again, we completely agree. By we, I mean all policy and stakeholders agree with that concept. So I don't think that's really what is in dispute here. It's also important to note, though, because there's a lot of conversation about Europe, and we at ASBM have spent a lot of time working with the Europeans. And in fact, next week, I will be in Brussels at the 7th stakeholder meeting with the European Commission. And I think they've done a really fabulous job of working with stakeholders to help explain the process and where there are ways to improve it and so on in terms of moving biosimilars forward. And I think that's an incredibly important aspect. And we actually, ASBM did a webinar last year where we talked about, if you want to learn from the European success, we feel like the US is on the right track and they're trying to follow in that model. So understanding that in Europe, for the most part, automatic substitution is not allowed in most Western European countries, and the physician has definitely input in terms of what is going to be dispensed, prescribed and then dispensed. And what we're talking about when we talk about interchangeable biosimilars in the US is the fact that from a policymaker and legislator's perspective, I think that Congress was prescient in terms of when they set up the BPCIA and when they established a biosimilar pathway. They recognized that ultimately, if you want to speed up the process for confidence, which Dr. McKibben certainly pointed out is a result of an interchangeable biosimilar, where that additional data, or at least being able to demonstrate that something was provided that can give additional assurances as to what happens when switches occur, they allowed essentially for an interchangeable biosimilar. And then from that, there was work over nearly 10 years to establish within now all 50 states that if you are approved as a interchangeable biosimilar, that is a regulatory standard here in the US, with that additional data or the assurances that are provided without the data, that you will have the ability to be automatically substituted in all 50 states. And you see in this slide the key features of the agreed upon legislation. Only interchangeable biosimilars will be automatically substituted. Physicians are able to prevent a substitution they feel is inappropriate, dispense as written. Pharmacists must communicate to physicians within 3 to 5 days that a substitution has occurred, and patient notification required in many states. These 4 things were basically required in every piece of legislation, and over a period of almost 10 years, we got 50 states to agree to pass this legislation. So those prerequisites are really important to consider when you're talking about, changing how you can automatically substitute. As I say to people, not one state would have agreed to automatically substitute non-interchangeable biosimilars. And it's not because a non-interchangeable biosimilar is a worse biosimilar than an interchangeable biosimilar. It's not better or worse. It is simply that additional data provides assurances for physicians, for pharmacists, and most importantly for patients, ultimately that they can automatically substitute, and they don't even, there's no pre-notification with regards to the physician. Even the physician has signed off on that. So we're going to talk through the panel discussion about that. And I'm going to pause there for a minute to see if Dr. Schneider or Dr. McKibben or Andy want to jump in just on that particular process.
Well, maybe I can start. This was a long, a lengthy process because these practices are regulated at the state level in the United States, as opposed to European countries that can do things across the entire country a little bit more easily and efficiently. And so it required us to visit each of these states as Pharmacy Practice Acts were being revised to enable a pharmacist to offer a patient a less expensive biologic as an alternative. I think the aim initially was to look at expensive biologic medicines as really having the potential for bankrupting patients or health system budgets and so forth. So they wanted to apply lessons learned from the generic drugs for simple molecules to biologics, and the biosimilar was considered a generic biologic. But as Dr. McKibben has pointed out, they're similar but not identical. And so, but on the other hand, there is a need to have price competition in the marketplace. And so one of the ways that the FDA has enabled this is to create an interchangeability designation, which makes a biologic substitutable without a physician having to be contacted in advance. I think physicians were objected to that because they felt it was their patient and their decision, and these drugs are different enough so that they weren't particularly supportive of having pharmacists empowered to do this. When I visited with my colleagues around the state, I found that I was on the opposite side of this issue because the pharmacists felt that this notification requirement was onerous, it would take time, that the record keeping would be difficult for them as well. And so we had to come up with compromises between organized medicine, medical societies, and pharmacy societies that focused on sometimes verbal small words. For example, a lot of the legislation said the pharmacist needs to notify the physician, and we changed that to communication, communicate to the physician to reflect more of a collaborative practice in the issue. Record keeping requirements were modified to make them a little bit less onerous for patients. And so as a result of these compromises and a long process of meeting with legislators and hearing different points of view presented, this automatic substitution legislation was passed in all 50 states.
I'll just say one more thing about it, because it's so very often when we look at legislation and cost, we tend to, what they say, silo things. So we have the pharmacy silo, and we look at the pharmacy cost, we look at the insurance premium cost, et cetera. But as a practitioner, one of the things that we do recognize is while there's a cost to medication, there's also a cost to the system. Are you in the hospital more or less often? Do you have complications that require hospitalization? And so I was a lead author on a white paper with Digestive Disease National Coalition a couple of years ago where we looked at the data actually from the managed healthcare literature that shows that there can very easily be increased cost to the healthcare system by doing non-medical switching. And many of these patients end up back on the original drugs, et cetera. So while we pat ourselves on the back for doing immediate substitution or easy substitution, someone really should be looking at total cost. And that's, again, part of the reason to have stakeholders, as they've talked about. Everyone had to get together and say, this actually is the best way to do it. And that is, again, confidence building for everyone, including the policymakers.
And what I would add to all of that is that I'm the guy that actually went to the states and argued for this law to be passed, and it wasn't easy, as Phil Schneider says. In the beginning, this was a battle. This was patient advocates on one side of the stage at these state legislatures, and a large group of stakeholders on the other side fighting back against this, from physicians to pharmacists to manufacturers of biosimilars and to PBMs and insurers. And it was a fight. And in order to get agreement, in order to get 50 states to agree on this legislation, it took, as Michael says, almost a decade of arguing and traveling to these states. And essentially what really tipped the scale was that we were able to convince the other side, the physicians and the pharmacists, that it was okay to allow pharmacists to automatically substitute an interchangeable biosimilar because there were two different standards of approval. And everybody agreed that this second standard of approval, this interchangeability standard of approval, was a higher standard of approval, and it gave more confidence to physicians to prescribe them, and it gave more confidence to patients to take them because there were different standards of approval. And now the threats are that despite the different standards of approval, we're just going to ignore all that and ignore all these agreements in 50 states that were made. We're just going to now decide that despite a different standard for approval of regular biologics instead of interchangeable biologics, we're going to make them all interchangeable. And that's not what was sold to all of the stakeholders to get buy-in in all of the 50 states. As Dr. Schneider says, physicians were initially reluctant to support any automatic substitution. But once we told them that there was a higher standard of approval, there was a different standard of approval for these interchangeable biosimilars, that's what got the buy-in. So I don't know how you can erase all of that decade of work and agreements. There really are like contractual agreements among all of the stakeholders to get these laws passed in 50 states. And I don't know how you just take a pencil and just erase all of that to save money. Now, that's my perspective on it, Michael.
Well, and from there, I'm going to, a couple of things I want to just touch on that was just said. And from Andy's, when Andy talks about the higher degree of the higher standard, I would just say as a former regulator, it's important to recognize the fact that the perception is reality to those stakeholders that were involved in setting up this compromise legislation that ended up being passed in all 50 states. So the idea is not that, and it goes back to, is a non-interchangeable biosimilar any worse or any better than a interchangeable biosimilar. An interchangeable biosimilar is not a better biosimilar. They are both approved by the FDA with regards to the safety and efficacy, and for that reason are interchangeable by the European definition of interchangeable biosimilars. Having said that, I have found, and doing a lot of work globally, especially in Europe, that there's always been a little bit of, and in Canada, I would say, a little bit of, it's almost an envy, but it's certainly irritation with the idea that we have this interchangeable standard And the argument goes that essentially, if you talk about it as an interchangeable biosimilar and you distinguish it from a non-interchangeable biosimilar, you basically are indicating that it is an inferior product. Clearly, that is not the case. Clearly, that is not anything that, we as an organization, me as a former regulator, I think it's really important to make that distinction so that patients understand that, physicians understand that, and pharmacists understand that. But really what we're talking about here today is this is within the idea of allowing for automatic substitution. So you're beginning to remove the physician from the equation. And in order to take that next step, interchangeable biosimilar means something more to, we know, pharmacists, physicians, and patients, because that was all worked upon and basically compromised through legislation through that process that I just talked about. So to be very clear, whether, we have folks on from all over the world on this call, we know a number of countries are represented. It is not necessarily that, an interchangeable biosimilar is a better biosimilar. It is not, but it does help to provide that additional data, because we've seen from survey after survey, we've seen from country after country, and most notably probably where this was demonstrated was in Australia, where they had very severe problems in the beginning in terms of uptake. And we were over meeting with the Department of Health and the TGA, and we talked over there in 2015, 2016 about the concept of interchangeable biosimilars. And they thought that was a great concept because ultimately, as I said to them, the TGA could approve, if the US FDA approved a biosimilar as an interchangeable biosimilar, the TGA could do the same. And so we basically, a lot of today's conversation is to make it clear that the distinction is important because it's the perception of that additional data, whether that data was required through switching studies or whether that data was required through some other means, it still is a different standard. And we think Congress got it right by giving it to the FDA, and FDA got it right by basically setting out as the most easy way to get it approved as an interchangeable biosimilar. In other words, not making it onerous on the manufacturer in terms of requiring excessive data, but certainly making a distinction between an interchangeable and a non-interchangeable biosimilar.
Hey, and Michael, could I ask a question of the panel? I'm watching some of the questions come in from the audience, and I think several of the questions get to the issue of, is there something in the middle between an interchangeable designation and just being a product that cannot be switched? For example, if a product had multiple switching studies or a very strong switching study, but did not have the designation from the FDA in the US, or is there some way that, more like traditional drugs, there might be some sort of in vitro testing that could be performed on these molecules to try to searching for the right word, but sort of short circuit the need for a full review? And maybe people could comment a little bit about.
I'd like to comment on that because, if you look at scientific studies, you watch the news, you'll see that something causes cancer, something does this and that. Studies come and go, and studies are a timeline. You do competing studies, overlapping studies, etc. In my mind, what the interchangeability does, it allows an expert panel to review all available evidence and say this truly is interchangeable. Isolated studies done in one country or one group, you have to vet those studies. You have to look at them and say, well, is it a good study, a bad study? How does it compare? It's too easy for stakeholders to say, well, I have 6 studies that show it's the same, but was that really an expert panel? Why is a regulator empowered to take isolated studies that they don't even understand how it works? Just because the results in their favor, they can use that and say, well, we're just going to do that. We like, as physicians, an expert panel to look at this going forward. Again, it's a process, not a thing. And Michael said, this is not to be onerous. I mean, I think if there are obviously different studies. They're not all going to be switching studies. There could be in vitro studies, pharmacokinetic data, et cetera. It's a summary of all available information looked at by an expert panel who then make that designation of interchangeable. And to me, that's very comforting because I can't keep track of every medication and every indication, et cetera, so that I can advise my patients. My job is to take care of patients, and I need those expert panels to give me my designations and approvals. And medicines come and go. They withdraw them because new data shows it's not good, et cetera. And I know that that's been done by an expert panel, and that's comforting.
And can I jump in there too, Steve, to the question? I think the challenge, first of all, we're talking about what's the remit of the FDA. What I think Congress did in terms of establishing that, okay, there is this different standard. They didn't tell the FDA how to set up that different standard. They didn't tell the FDA this is what you need to do because it's outside their expertise. Frankly, they did it as an acknowledgement that if you can have that additional standard, and it goes back to what Dr. McKibben said about the idea that in the beginning there was this conversation about generic biologics, that conversation, which science said, no, it's not generic biologics. They're not the same. It's not the same model. The whole purpose for the interchangeable approval in the US was to get it closer to that model, close enough, in fact, that it could be treated that way at the state level, which is exactly what's happened through the state legislation. So to me, the idea of, is there a way to do it easier? We know that you can have an interchangeable biosimilar with no switching studies. The FDA has already made that happen. So, I kind of feel like the time is, you have now these interchangeable biosimilars coming out. It's clear that an interchangeable biosimilar is possible. It's, to me, pretty obvious that the FDA is going to try and do this in the least onerous process as possible, because they want these things to happen. And essentially, and we haven't even got into the legislation and the rules and all of that, and we will, essentially what's going on is there is an attempt to short circuit or to tie the hands of the FDA with regards to how they go about approving an interchangeable biosimilar, or even blur the distinction between an interchangeable biosimilar and a non-interchangeable biosimilar. And again, we're not talking about better or worse. We're talking about additional data or some assurances that were provided that give those stakeholders that were involved in 50 states legislation the confidence that they can make an automatic substitution, which now has taken the actual decision out of the hands of the physician and given it to the pharmacist. And I think we'll get more into that as we move on, but that's a really important point.
And I think one of the differences is that an interchangeability designation reflects a population-based patient care management, whereas physician-controlled prescribing deals with interpatient variability. And so the higher standard for interchangeability requires drug therapy decisions to be made or modified based on economic issues that are based on population issues. And so those interchangeability studies, I think, are necessary to know whether making policy decisions that affect multiple patients, not individual patient factors, which the prescriber needs to take into account, is important. So as we get more information about the equivalency of a biosimilar to a reference product, I think individual prescribers will take that into decision and making what decisions about what they prescribe for their individual patients. But to empower the pharmacist to make a decision for large populations of patients requires a higher standard, which is the interchangeability standard.
Yep. Well, from there, I'm going to start getting into a little bit of the specifics with regards to legislation, because part of this, I said in the beginning that the timing of this webinar is extremely good because there's just a lot going on around this issue, and it began, as I said, with the EMA statement put out last fall about what how all biosimilars are interchangeable. I do believe that statement was put out not just looking to the US, but also to the EU, but also looking to understanding that distinction in the US, what interchangeable biosimilar means. We certainly have talked a lot about that. Specifically, though, now there is a attempt to undermine, blur the distinction, and basically kind of undo a lot of what was done over the course of that decade in terms of establishing that compromise, which led to the ability for pharmacists to automatically substitute interchangeable biosimilars. And that is just a couple of examples. The most recent one would be the PDAB proposal. That's the Prescription Drug Advisory Board proposal, which is being considered in Oregon right now and will be reviewed and considered on December 13th. Ultimately, what it does is add language which permits a non-interchangeable biosimilar to be substituted. We have talked about the fact that obviously previously only an interchangeable biosimilar. So that isn't even talking about trying to figure out a way to, change how we approve interchangeable biosimilars. It's simply an acknowledgement that we're now just going to lump interchangeable and non-interchangeable biosimilars into one group in order to basically increase uptake. It also, interestingly, eliminates the patient notification of the substitution, which is an incredible thing to do, given that you now are going to substitute and you're not going to let the patient notice that the substitution is going to occur of a non-interchangeable biosimilar. So that's just one piece of legislation that's currently being considered. There's also a piece, HB 403 in Louisiana, which adds language which permits, again, a non-interchangeable biosimilar to be substituted, where previously only an interchangeable biosimilar could be substituted. We can all be sure that this is going to proliferate across the states right now. And again, with really no reason specifically, no real justification for undoing the 10 years of work that was done to compromise among a whole group of stakeholders, as Andy talked about, including, most importantly, patients, physicians, and pharmacists. But these laws, you get the sense, are basically attempts to just change the rules of the game in the middle of the game. Once we have figured out and moved, the last state was approved, I believe, in 2021. That was Oklahoma. So literally it took that period of time to get all 50 states on board. And I know we've all talked about how difficult it is to get 50 states to agree to anything these days. On top of that, at the federal level, we have the Senate Bill 2035, which is known as the Biosimilar Red Tape Elimination Act. It would do a number of things. It recently has been amended to include a provision that was originally in a HELP bill, which would deem all biosimilars interchangeable, that is substitutable at the pharmacy without physician authorization, and also restricts FDA flexibility in requiring switching studies. Initially, it actually banned the FDA from being able to ask for switching studies. It said that manufacturers could submit them, but of course, why would they if they were not asked to? Number one. And so in recognition, I think, of some pushback around the idea of banning it, they set up hurdles, which include basically getting the Senate Help Committee chair and ranking member to justify, to have a meeting with the secretary to justify the need for a switching study to be used. And having worked in both the secretary's office and on the Hill, that is a pretty high bar to clear indeed. So again, looking to leverage the idea of comfort among the patient, physician, and pharmacist communities with interchangeables, and then to change what an interchangeable biosimilar means through legislation at the state or federal level. In addition to that, this CMS recently proposed a rule on November 6th, which allows Part D sponsors to treat formulary substitutions, basically allowing for non-interchangeable biologics to be substituted for the reference product. And what is interesting about this, as a person who spent 6 years dealing with regulations from CMS, a year ago, CMS put out a regulation which was allowing for substitution of interchangeable biosimilars. And in the rule they put out, the wording you see on the screen, we are not proposing to permit Part D sponsors to immediately substitute biosimilar products. Biosimilar products have not met additional requirements to support a demonstration of interchangeability. So in a year, they have completely reversed course on the rule without any justification other than just they did it. Essentially, I think the point overall is, as we see these things, we want to make sure that we have a full understanding of the definition of interchangeable, of the importance of realizing that we're not talking better or worse. As I've said multiple of times, it is not about the quality of the medicine. It is about the additional data. And one thing we have found through a lot of work, survey work in particular, is that physicians, and Dr. McKibben can probably talk about this, physicians do see differently. The absence of data isn't data. Data is data. It's not the absence of data. So a lot of the conversations around biosimilars has really said, you need to provide data that demonstrates there are adverse events. You need to provide data that demonstrates that something is happening within the population that we don't know about. Otherwise, since the burden is on you, we should, move forward unless that data is provided. And we know, just generally that adverse event reporting, lots of it, as we've reflected in survey work, there's a real problem with regards to the accuracy of adverse event reporting. Dr. McKibben, if you want to just touch on that.
Yeah. Again, data, as I said earlier, there are individual studies out there. You'll see switching studies and things will show that can or cannot work. It needs to be vetted, and there needs to be consensus among experts. The problem I have with the Lee bill is, why would legislative people even be considered experts as to whether or not you need a switching study? On what basis can they make an informed decision? Why are they involved? That's just a roadblock. I'm not saying you shouldn't review the process, et cetera, but legislative people should not be in the pathway here. This is not what it's about. So physicians want data. Again, when you look at safety outside of medications, look at automobile safety. Boy, things have changed a lot, and it's a moving target. Same thing with medications. We want to be able to do this, and we don't want things fixed in stone. This is the only way to do an interchangeable. It's a process. We look at it, we use new studies, new data, and I think they should be requiring that too. This is just an aside, that if you're going to do switching with artificial intelligence and big data, and perhaps our European colleagues could help on this. If they switch a bunch of people, does it actually drive up system costs? Did it actually work? Did they save money or not? It's harder to do in the US with multiple insurance carriers and different states and regulatory pathways. But this data is important because biosimilars are only 20 years old or whatever. This is forever. We need to constantly look at how we do this, and we want to know that the decision-making processes that we're putting in place are true and valid, not regulated by things behind closed doors without transparency based on dollars. Non-medical switching for expensive medications like biosimilars is obvious, but this also process applies to ostomy supplies and IVs, et cetera. And there's a wealth of literature where, you're on an IV and the carrier will switch you to a locking device and your IV tubing doesn't match. And now you can't get you what you need because they saved a penny. So the process of having non-medical providers or non-expert providers and stakeholders involved in the process is not helpful, and it's not reassuring to the public. Adding the patient voice has been wonderful. And it didn't, Andy, you know this, we didn't have a wonderful GaBI article recently about, do we need pharmacokinetic studies in the Asian population? Because Asian populations often have different metabolism pathways for drugs like Prilosec or omeprazole. And do we really need to do that for biosimilars? Well, probably not. But we know that because we did the studies that show it doesn't make a difference. Again, we got data to show that we don't need this. We didn't just assume anything. So that's a two-way street. We can cut costs and we can improve the process. And that, to me, is the only way to go. That's why we're having this conversation, to get voices heard. And the voices of our people listening today know that this is, in fact, a discussion, not a decree.
Thanks, Dr. McKibben. Steve, if you want to move on to the panel discussion.
Oh, I'd be happy to. The one of the issues that caught my attention was when Dr. McKibben mentioned that um, that he had worked on a study where switching actually increased costs to the overall health system. And I wondered if he could provide a little more detail about that. And I'm particularly interested in Andy's reaction to some of the things that Dr. McKibben found in his study from a patient perspective. I suspect, but I'm curious as to whether some of the things you found, Dr. McKibben, reflect burdens that are placed on the families and the individual patient and even their ability to work.
So, so first of all, it wasn't just a study; it was a summary paper reviewing the literature in managed care, and Digestive Disease National Coalition has a link on their website, ddnc.org. System costs are not the same thing as medication costs. And then, so the first thing is C. Everett Koop, our old attorney or surgeon general back in the day, made a famous comment: "Is the best medicine is the one that people will actually use." So, as an example, and we didn't talk about this yet, but we're discussing the medication, not necessarily the binders or the distribution method. So adalimumab, which was used for the treatment of GI and rheumatologic disorders, is an injectable. And when it initially came out, it had citric acid in it and it burned a lot. And patients would come in and say, "I saw that YouTube video where people were screaming," which is probably an exaggeration, but they didn't want to take it. And so they took the citric acid out, but there are biosimilars that have citric acid in it. So are people actually going to use that? Or are they going to come up with excuses to get out of it? That's one example. If you have bad arthritis and the self-injector is cumbersome because you don't have the studied one, are you actually going to use it or be able to use it? And so these are the things that drive it. Anecdotally, I have had patients stable for 10, 15 years, switch to a biosimilar, and come in with a flare. And there are studies that show there are flares. VA did a big study on this. There are other studies out there. So there's burdens to families. I think anxiety and worry. This is not a one-size-fits-all process. And the studies are out there. Again, this is the managed care literature. This is not a medical study. This is the managed care people looking at their own data said we drove up system costs. So people should look at that. Regulators, legislative decision makers, and stakeholders should be empowered. We tell our stories, I always say, as the illustrations, but the data is on the side. So we want to illustrate the data that we have. So yes, I should say, look at the cost. And just as closing, just to say, last year ASBM did an ophthalmology study. So the excipients or dissolving agents in biosimilars are not the same everywhere. So remember I said that many of these diseases are systemic. You get an injection or an infusion, but ophthalmologists are often directly injecting into the eye. And many of these some of these dissolving agents are not even approved for eye use, but they're being told to use the biosimilar. So future indications, future ways of using the medicines have to be able to be brought in and say, is this really the same for everyone? The answer is no. And it goes back to that, as Phil said, there's interpatient variability and population things. Pregnant women with Crohn's disease, the rule of thumb we always said was 1/3 get better, 1/3 get worse, and 1/3 stay the same. So technically everything's the same. It doesn't change unless you're one of those people. So statistically, it doesn't change. You spend the same amount, but the patient has to have their say here. So I'll leave it at that. I can talk forever on the subject.
I want to jump in just to that point, Steve, to the underlying question about what Dr. McKibben said with regards to the study. And that is that when I was in the secretary's office working with Secretary Leavitt, he really placed an emphasis on trying to get at what are those, the difference between costs associated with medicines and costs with regards to what happens if a medicine isn't working? You're talking about hospitalizations, you're talking about surgeries, you're talking about missed time work, all of that. Even within, when we were trying to get transparency on, let's unpack a DRG or let's unpack a particular payment bundle and say, what is the cost of this part of that bundle? What is the cost of that part of the bundle? The hospitals in the beginning couldn't even do it themselves. They couldn't tell you how much it costs for the surgery component versus how much it costs for the stay component versus the whatever. And so I think that is definitely one of the things overall when you talk about the study that he mentioned, or the idea of the, if you switch and you end up having something happen as a result of that, again, whatever that may be, there are costs associated with that. And certainly I think that's a cost that is really hard to quantify, but easy to kind of understand, because you certainly can admit when you look at the larger healthcare payments, even within the Medicare system, they're not for medicines. They are for, all of those other costs that go along with hospitalizations and so on. Andy?
Yeah. So, you and Dr. McKibben have really covered that issue really well. What I would say is that it all goes back to the fact that biosimilars are different from the originator product. Right? We don't want to skip over that. They are different. They can't possibly be identical to the originator product. The biosimilar cannot be identical. They are, by definition, similar. So their mechanisms of actions are going to be different and the results are going to be different. And it's very hard to document all of that. Michael, as you said, adverse event reporting is almost non-existent around the world. And often they wouldn't even know why the patient changed. Was it because they changed to a biosimilar or not? But all of that aside, what I heard you say, Michael, about that proposed legislation is that none of that matters, because even though we have two completely different definitions for approval of a regular biologic, a regular biosimilar, and an interchangeable biosimilar. So the FDA has two completely different definitions for the approval of those two medicines. And what they're trying to do now is to move all of these approvals. There's 30, 40 approvals now, 50 approvals of biosimilars in the US, and move them all under this definition that they weren't approved under. And the word, and I hate to be dramatic about it, but the word that comes to my mind is betrayal. Betrayal that the FDA has said that we're going to allow interchangeability for products approved under this definition. And all of us stakeholders, from the patient community to the physician community, to patients themselves, to prescribers, to the pharmacists, they all agreed that because of this additional language that the FDA has put forward for interchangeable biosimilars, we will all agree to automatic substitution of those. And it's simply betrayal to then bring all of these other drugs that were approved under this definition into this definition. And Michael, as you say, this bill that would remove the notification provision, when I hear that, it makes me angry, because we argued so hard that a patient should be notified if the doctor prescribes a certain product and it gets switched by the pharmacist. Could you imagine a patient not being told that their medicine has been switched on them? And can you imagine their record, their patient chart, not having that information in that? So if the patient comes back and they have a change, they have a different side effect, or they have some new issue that they didn't have before the switch occurred, the physician won't even know that a switch occurred to blame it on that. So it's truly betrayal in my mind, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, I want to thank you, Andy, for that. Just a couple of things about it. I think it's important, and I've said this a number of times today, to establish that with regards to the standard, with regards to the FDA approving a biosimilar, not a non-interchangeable biosimilar, but a biosimilar, the standard in essence is really the same. To be clear, Andy, in terms of what is that standard? What I said before about how we passed the legislation is what is missing from physician confidence, patient confidence, and to a smaller extent, pharmacist confidence, and Dr. Schneider can talk about this, is additional data that tells you the standard, that the difference between the two is both are approved with regards to safety and efficacy, so that Dr. McKibben can substitute. So when I said they meet the EU definition of interchangeable biosimilars. However, an interchangeable biosimilar in the US requires additional data, or maybe not data, but some assurances through some mechanism to be able to demonstrate that it is the same effect in any given patient. That's the language in the legislation. It is a higher standard with regards to you have to demonstrate something more. So I call it kind of approval plus. And that approval plus, which took the FDA a number of years to figure out how they were going to do that. That was the challenge in the beginning. I remember back 2011, 2012, when they were talking about, will they ever figure out what it means? Because just because Congress gave it to them doesn't mean they know how to do it. They had to figure it out. And they finally figured it out. And they certainly did so with regards to understanding, again, I keep saying, least burdensome on the regulator. Why? Not because they're trying to be nice to the regulators, but ultimately because they know that in the long run, especially now that the work has been done within all 50 states, you are going to have advantages. So if you are approved, if you are a manufacturer who applied to get an interchangeable designation and you get it, you should be benefiting from that because you put in extra work. And so my perspective on it, as rather than kind of look at it as all of this legislation, the Part D rule, the state legislation, to me is kind of looking at this as a failure, that we are still not able to move quickly to get these automatically substituted because of this interchangeable blockade, which we're trying to basically weaken, right? Really what we're trying to do is say, we recognize that the patient, the physician, and the pharmacist communities acknowledge that an interchangeable designation means a little more to us. Not that it's better or worse, but it means more to them. And when you're working on compromising and coming up with legislative achievements where you can get all 50 states to agree, it means enough to them to say, if you tried to, as I said in the very beginning, if you tried to have passed that legislation and it said non-interchangeable biosimilar, it would not have passed, period. So now what's going on is an attempt to kind of redefine what an interchangeable is, or blur the distinction between one, or completely eliminate the requirements to be one. And that to me is the biggest problem and should make everybody a little bit suspicious about ultimately who is driving the idea. I think it was Dr. McKibben who said, and I totally agree, what in the world would a legislator know about what is needed to make a determination of an interchangeable biosimilar by a regulator? Nothing. So ultimately, there's a reason behind this decision to try and, in a pretty short order, considering that the last state was passed in 2021, 2 years ago, we got on board all 50 states. Less than 2 years later, we are at the state and federal level trying to weaken the efforts of a lot of folks who compromised.
I think what's at stake here is the ability of healthcare professionals to retain responsibility for making patient care decisions on behalf of their patients. And the current hard-earned system that we have in our country does that. And the bills that are being considered in different states as well as nationally are regulators attempting to save money by taking the responsibility for making patient care decisions away from those that have responsibility and accountability for the patient. And so I think that's the issue. And as Dr. McKibben has said, they don't have the competence to be able to impose those kind of restrictions on clinical decision makers and on their patients. And that's why I think these are really fundamentally important issues.
The physician-patient relationship is always the cornerstone of our healthcare relationship, and the physician bears responsibility with the patient to do a collaborative agreement for their care. The interchangeable allows me to delegate to Phil and his colleagues. If they go to the pharmacy and they switch it, I'm comfortable with that, because those studies have been done. I do have the ability to say dispense as written or do not substitute or whatever our individual states allow. But that extra layer of certainty, because And now to take away the reporting or notification concept, that doesn't even make sense. Now it's not even in my record that the medication was switched. I had similar problems in the past with just an anti-anxiety medication in a celiac patient. They got switched to several generics. The originator and the first generic did not have gluten, and the third one did. Terrible flare. Couldn't figure out why. It's because they got switched to a different generic without notification. So it may be minor, but it's important. And these are the people that drive up healthcare costs. Remember the bell curve. That's the people at the high end who drive the system cost. As much as 80% of all healthcare costs is that top percentage of people. And that's what the biosimilars represent. And we need to look at that. Population and total medication costs are not necessarily where it's at. We need the confidence. And just looking at the ASBM studies overall, and again, they're not identical studies, but with time, the level of concern regarding non-medical switching is rising among providers. So we haven't become more complacent because we think it's really not an issue. With time, we're actually becoming more concerned. So I take that as a signal for what it's worth. This is not an issue that's going to go away from the provider standpoint, nor the physician-patient relationship. The patients rely on us to turn around and look at the bookshelf behind me and pull down the references, et cetera. Patients cannot, they are experts on them, but they're not necessarily experts on the healthcare diagnosis and treatment. And we do this together. My job is to educate them, and we come up with this agreement. And we need to utilize that rather than just have blanket switching for money. And the pharmacists are absolute team members that need to be involved with this. When you go there and he's going to switch it, he can give the counseling, he or she can give the counseling that's needed to say, look, this interchangeable has a higher level of significance. We know that there are no increased consequences to this, and you'll save money. That's a great thing, other than to say, well, we don't really know. So I'll leave it at that. I'm all for the notification, and I'm all for the team approach with pharmacists and other stakeholders.
I want to just, the last point you made was demonstrated the idea that as confidence, you talked about how physicians' concern about third-party switching, non-medical switching is increasing. And it's interesting because it is at the same time that overall confidence in biosimilars is also increasing exponentially. So in 2019, ASBM did a survey, as you know, Dr. McKibben, in Europe, which I presented at ESMO in Barcelona. And what was very well received there was the fact that while, of course, in Europe, confidence in biosimilars is as high as it can be, basically in the high 90s, we had done a survey in 2013, and we did another one in 2019. What it showed from 2013 to 2019 is as confidence went up, physicians' concerns with non-medical switching went up at the same time. And so that exactly makes your point. And that's in Europe, where they have had, they haven't had a advantage in terms of the number of years they've had experience with biosimilars. I want to just, before I'm going to turn it back to you, Steve, in terms of we are getting towards the end of the program, and I want to make sure that before folks sign off, if they have to get off early or whatever, that this isn't just a conversation about, well, what's the problem and there's nothing to be done about it. ASBM really, has spent years basically being engaged and involved in, as Dr. McKibben talked about, his hobby of trying to change minds and policy rather than just complaining. This slide is a series of QR codes and links that can go directly to some of the pieces of legislation that we have talked about here. So ultimately, the Part D rule that I talked about, there's a QR code there to submit comments to CMS. Certainly with regards to the Lee bill and the Oregon bill and the Louisiana bill. So I think from our perspective, this is not just about telling you what the problem is, but it is also providing you with opportunities for anyone on here or anyone on here who might know someone else who wants to weigh in. We certainly do encourage you to do so. We are definitely, and I think it comes across in this presentation, concerned about the direction this conversation is going. And on top of that, and finally, with regards to slides, this is just some additional resources that are there for anybody. And of course, anything you may also find on our website which is safebiologics.org. I would like to say just one shout out for Dr. Schneider in particular. He has spent the entire year working with the Ohio State University on a whole series of CE courses that are co-branded between ASBM and the Ohio State University. And interchangeable biosimilars is one of those courses, but we have really developed a good relationship with them, and that's largely as a result of his relationships there. So with that, Steve, I want to turn it back to you. There's still 10, 12 minutes left, but I want to make sure and get that in before we end it up.
Well, I just wanted to confirm with you, Michael, so the policies that you described, in Oregon and with Senator Lee and with others, those are all still pending policies. Nothing's been finalized yet.
Correct.
And I wondered if you and others would have some comments about what is effective in a situation like this. I am absolutely overwhelmed by the idea that 50 states all agreed to the same thing within a relatively compact period of time in the big picture. And maybe you all could talk a little bit about what drove the alignment, what drove those outcomes besides a lot of probably shoe leather and sitting down with people and explaining things.
Well, I'll start off, and then certainly Andy and Dr. Schneider in particular, who are engaged, can weigh in as well. But I will just say Dr. Schneider mentioned when he was talking about words, language. I mean, there were literally the perceptions. I say to folks in general that there is a tension that exists between the pharmacists and the physicians in some respect. And an acknowledgement of that is the difference between words that seem like they are directing you to do something and words that are collaborative in terms of how you do it. Certainly the fact that we put up what are the 4 key elements, the process was from 2013 to probably 2017. Only a handful of states finally got on board and passed this legislation. The beginning process was trying to figure out through the various stakeholders what we could agree on. And so once that was finally figured out, then the process went much quicker. And, again, anything with 50 states, I think Andy said in our podcast, I can't remember the last thing I worked on that had all 50 states. I mean, you're talking about doing it at the state level. You're not talking about federally directing all 50 states to be involved. You're talking about getting state by state Pharmacy Practice Act legislation in every single state. That is a difficult process. And so it seems very odd to me as to why within 2 years of the passage of the last of the 50, you would begin to completely undermine the whole intent of the legislation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Schneider and Andy, who are both involved as well.
Well, the way the legislation was affected, as Andy's pointed out, was a lot of airplane tickets. There are a lot of hearings that are held by health subcommittees of the legislature. And so we appeared before those subcommittees to talk about what was in the best interest of the patients. And so that may have to happen again, I guess, in Oregon. What bothers me about the Oregon as a pharmacist is it might pit the prescribers and patients against the pharmacists that are going to be asked to be able to substitute, for only based on an economic consideration and not considering individual patient considerations. And so while we've worked on a system to allow the pharmacists and the physicians and the patients to trust each other in terms of what's the best clinical decision that balances effectiveness, safety, and the responsible use of limited resources is the term I like to use, not the cheapest drug, but we have expensive drugs and limited resources. And so balancing those 3 things, making sure that effectiveness and safety are the primary considerations, is really taken away by these kind of legislation. So the message that I would take to a legislator or a health subcommittee as they continue to debate the issues that they're considering in Oregon and Louisiana, and perhaps even at the federal level, would be to say, don't undermine the role that healthcare professionals have to work with their patients to make the best decisions. Don't overemphasize, don't forget about effectiveness and safety as we try to make responsible use of limited resources. We can do that ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, and much of it comes down to the language that was used. I remember in the beginning of the journey of going to all these states, it was very contentious. And it was, as I said, patient advocates on and some prescribers on the one side, and then many stakeholders who had a financial interest in this decision on the other side. And it was contentious. There were state hearings that I'm not going to spend time going into each state hearing, but there were some very, very, very spirited debates that were going on, let's just say. And what it took was all of the stakeholders to actually sit down and talk and work out this language that all of us agreed to, the physicians, the policymakers, the payers, the PBMs, the patients. We all agreed on, as Michael showed, the 4 principles that then got passed in all 50 states. And that's what's so frustrating for me, is that was a lot of work. It was a lot of work to get the stakeholders to agree on language. And in large part, the big issue that was discussed was this interchangeability designation and the data that's used for it. And once doctors, and back then, by the way, there wasn't even an application for an interchangeable biosimilar to the FDA. And so that was part of the argument, that what are we doing all this for when there's not even an interchangeable biosimilar on the market, or even proposed to be on the market. And now, of course, they are on the market. So we spent all these years preparing for this time, and now they're here, and these pieces of legislation are looking to, again, erase all of that work that all of the stakeholders agreed to. And it's a total reversal by the FDA. So it's for that reason that we're definitely against these proposed legislations.
I would like to just say one thing on this topic before we move on, and that is that ultimately the idea of, this to me is an attempt to drive uptake. And there are those who would say that it doesn't even matter with regards to the designation itself because of the problem of the PBMs, the role they play specifically in keeping whatever medicine, whether it's a reference product or a biosimilar, off the formularies. And so that to me is part of the problem too, that this is very a misguided attempt to undermine and subvert a lot of work by, lots of stakeholders over a long period of time that was extremely well thought out, and compromise was done. And the reality is, the bigger problem ultimately, as our former chairwoman, Dr. Feldman, would say, are the PBMs. So in some respects, I think that would be part of the message that we would convey if we were back trying to, and unfortunately having to revisit this issue with legislators. It would be, say, the first question would be, why would you do this? Why would you make this change? And are you not simply acknowledging that the concept of interchangeable biosimilars is a success, that patients, physicians, and pharmacists all agree that it does make a difference? And I've said all along, perception is reality. So it does make a difference. They know that the FDA can or cannot require data that provides the additional level of assurance of what happens when switches occur. And why would you not? For me, if I were back in my seat in the secretary's office, I would be meeting with probably manufacturers who were talking about, what was the process for them to get to an interchangeable designation. And I would be holding them up as examples to encourage other manufacturers to do the same, with the confidence in the FDA to make the decision as to, we're not just going to be saying provide additional data, do switching studies, do whatever. We're going to look at the best possible method in each individual circumstance to be able to get an interchangeable designation. And the rest takes care of itself. And at that point, you have basically 50 states that have the ability to automatically substitute. If we were just to simply move towards trying to get them to actually be interchangeables, as we all understand the definition, by applying for an interchangeable rather than changing what it is, then we would be really leveraging all of the work that was done by all these stakeholders for 10 years.
And then wouldn't that drive physician confidence, patient confidence, and as a result, would increase the usage of biosimilars.
Of course. And it would
Right.
and it would leverage what is an advantage inherent in the US system relative to the rest of the world. It would become a model for the rest of the world to say that we thought on the front end that if we possibly provide this additional level, which again, not better, but different in terms of additional data or not, if it's not needed, we then become the model for the rest of the world. We already know from our own webinars in terms of looking at where the US is and where the EU is, we are catching up quick, if not passing the EU already with regards to where we are with biosimilars. They have different payer systems. We have to deal with PBMs. But at the end of the day, what we're really talking about right now is if it ain't broke, don't fix it with regards to what we did over 10 years to get that system set up.
I think we put those links up before for comments, et cetera. And I do think that from my experience with advocacy, and Andy can talk about this, but these people need to hear from patients and stakeholders concrete stories. And I like to say, like, find a study or an example that non-medical switching raises patient out-of-pocket expense, as an example, and then tell your story and then say that to them so they have concrete examples of what goes on. This is about money. Come on, it's money. They want to save money. Oregon's going broke, I hear. I don't know. They want to cut costs, save money. And so the idea is they need to know that system costs don't necessarily go down, or if the system costs go down, the cost to the patient goes up. They can't necessarily afford the medication. And so concrete examples of problems that occur with these things in your comments and highlighting the studies and things that you've seen and have links to there, I think are very effective in influencing decision makers. But just complaining and saying, I don't like this, they got stacks of those. So I think that's one thing I've learned in the stakeholder meetings is everybody has a valid point. So let's put them together and sell this, because I think Oregon and Louisiana and the Lee bill need definite comments from everyone out there. So that's it. Thank you.
And that's a great point, Dr. McKibben. Michael, do you know whether ASBM's comments will be on the website, or is there a place that people watching this can see ASBM's comments if they need some proposed language or some help getting their comments together?
They always are. They are available on our website, usually under resources. So obviously, sometimes we don't submit the comments until right at the deadline. We try to get them in as early as possible, but they're, certainly available. And anybody who would want to reach out to us for either, draft comments or whatever, we can help in any way we can. But we will certainly make our comments, as we did, for example, with regards to when we sent in, put out a statement on the CMS reg, we put a public statement, which we distributed so that people know kind of where our position is.
And how I see a bunch of patient advocates on this webinar. How would they get in touch with the organization?
I think if you just go on our website, there's a link to reach us. It will go to Ray or someone.
Okay.
Links for comments were posted in the chat as well for like Oregon, et cetera. So you can get you there for posting your comments.
Yep. Steve?
Well, super. Well, thank you so much, panelists. This was a fantastic discussion. I know I learned a lot today, and I want to thank all of our audience members for submitting questions and for participating in the webinar today. So with that, I guess back to the real world and on with our days, right?
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.